Hey everybody, and welcome to Pep Talk. I'm Ben here with,
Ella and Peyton.
and today's topic we'll be talking about domestic abuse and violence, a global issue.
So, Ben, what is domestic violence?
That's a great question, but before we start, we're going to show you this quick video about it.
Domestic abuse is a broad term that describes a pattern of behaviour where someone uses power and control over another that causes fear and intimidation. It usually happens between people who are or have been in a relationship or between family members. Unfortunately, abuse can happen between friends and work colleagues too. The term domestic abuse covers a lot of different things, and it's important to know what they are so that you can be aware of them happening to you or your friends. It includes behaviours that might seem obvious, such as verbal abuse, when someone criticises or belittles you, physical violence, when someone harms you, your family or pets, and sexual abuse, when someone forces you to perform sexual acts without your consent. But there are many things that you might not realise are domestic abuse, and these can sometimes be harder to look for and identify. For example, when someone controls your finances or spending, or punishes you for spending money or gives you money with strings attached, that's financial abuse. Someone who tries to control who your friends are, when you can socialise, or tries to cut you off from your family, that's social control and isolation. Someone turning up at your house or job unexpectedly and uninvited, or following you around, that's harassment. There is emotional and psychological abuse, where someone manipulates or threatens you or your family members and makes you feel like you can't trust your own thoughts and feelings. It's important to be aware of spiritual abuse. This can be someone criticising your faith or culture, or forcing you to act against your beliefs. It could also be someone trying to cut you off from your church family, or who uses scripture to control you. Technology can also play a part in domestic abuse. For example, someone sharing intimate photos or videos to embarrass or humiliate you is abuse. Likewise, someone constantly messaging or calling you, or posting abusive messages about you online is also abusive behaviour. So now that you know some of the different types of abuse, let's do what we can to help stop domestic abuse before it starts.
That video gives us an introduction to what domestic abuse is. It reminds us that abuse isn't always obvious and that it's not always physical. Let's take a closer look at the 5 major types of domestic violence so we can better recognize the signs and stop the violence. Physical abuse is what most people think of first. It involves using force to hurt, intimidate, or control someone. This might look like hitting, slapping, choking, or even blocking someone's path or breaking their belongings.
Even when it leaves bruises or broken bones, many victims don't speak up. This is because they may feel scared, ashamed, or trapped. The harm goes far beyond the physical wounds. Survivors often live with lasting pain, anxiety, or PTSD even after the abuse ends. Behind closed doors, many continue to suffer in silence.
Emotional abuse is often invisible, but it can be just as damaging. It's about using words or actions to tear someone down, to make them feel powerless, confused, or worthless.
You're so right about that, Peyton. Emotional abuse is so hard to identify when you're really in there in the moment.
This can include yelling, gaslighting, manipulation, insults, threats, or constant criticism. Phrases like "no one else would want you" or "you're too sensitive, I was just joking" are common red flags.
While emotional abuse doesn't leave bruises, it often leaves deep scars, and it often happens alongside other forms of abuse as well.
Sexual abuse involves non-consensual sexual activity or behavior, including rape, unwanted touching, or forcing someone into sexual acts. It's a serious violation of a person's rights and safety.
Sexual abuse isn't always as obvious as it's shown in movies or TV shows. In a relationship, it can mean being pressured, manipulated, or guilted into unwanted sexual activity. It can also include things like sabotaging birth control or ignoring consent entirely. Just because 2 people are in a relationship doesn't mean consent isn't still required. Financial abuse is about controlling someone through money.
It might look like not allowing a partner to work, stealing their paycheck, or forcing someone to stay by making them financially dependent. Imagine needing permission to buy food or spend your own money. That's not a relationship, that's control.
Financial abuse is one of the biggest reasons people don't leave. They literally can't afford to. Finally, digital abuse, something more common now than ever before. This is when someone uses phones, social media, or online tools to control or harass their partner. Many people don't take this seriously, especially in teen relationships, but it is abuse. It isolates the victim, invades their privacy, and builds control, all behind a screen.
Navigating a digital abusive relationship can be quite difficult as it's a relatively new idea.
Our generation is probably more likely to experience this as we live in such a technologically dominant world. Recognizing the signs is the first step into breaking the cycle. But we must also understand how and why does domestic violence start.
Before looking at how it starts, we must understand that everyone puts their best foot forward in the beginning of a relationship, but over time, the ugly sides tend to show. What's even more disturbing is that people who abuse others is often calculated. They do it to control others around them. It is not random, it's intentional. They want power.
So Ella, if understanding how and why domestic violence starts is so important, can you just break that down a little bit for us?
Well, Ben, abuse begins by tension building. This is a stage where stress starts to build. I'll touch more on that in a second. That is then followed by acting out. This is a stage where abuse actually occurs. Abuser acts out because they might feel threatened.
Looking back on the two stages, as we know, it begins with tension building. This is where the abuser is argumentative, angry, using criticism, swearing, and angry gestures. The person being abused often feels like they're walking on eggshells around them. Victim may also feel as though they must change their behavior to avoid triggering their partner. The next stage, as we slightly touched on, is the incident or acting out stage. As that tension builds, violence is highly likely. This is where a major act of violence occurs, whether that's physical, sexual attacks, threats to harm, as well as verbal abuse. This abuse will leave the victim feeling worthless, less than, scared, and or devastated. We must now understand what causes someone to become an abuser. Research shows that people who experience violence during their childhood are more likely to normalize it as adults. They may think abusive behavior is normal because it's what they grew up with, so they're more likely to continue the cycle. There is also a strong link between substance use and abuse. When someone uses drugs or alcohol, it can impair their judgment, increase aggression, and make violent behavior more likely. Personality traits can play a big role too. People with low self-esteem, narcissism, or a lack of empathy may be more likely to become abusive, especially if they use control to feel more powerful. We also have to consider social and cultural norms. In some places, harmful beliefs about gender roles or power in relationships can lead people to think abuse is acceptable or even deserved. This mindset is dangerous and completely wrong. And finally, there are other factors like mental health issues, financial stress, or lack of social support that can increase the risk of someone becoming abusive. However, let's be clear, none of these things excuse abuse. Understanding the causes helps us recognize red flags, stop the cycle, and support those who need help.
You may be thinking to yourself, the signs are so obvious from outsiders. So why do victims still stay?
That's a great question. The main reason people tend to stay is fear. The fear of leaving is greater than the fear of staying. They don't know what their abuser might do to them if they try to leave, but they do know what their life is like with that abuser. The next reason victims tend to stay is predictability. They feel they have more control over their abuser if they are together and are able to act in ways that are less triggering. The next reason people stay in these types of situations is because they're protecting others. Many victims don't want the abuse to extend to other friends or family. The case for lots of families facing domestic violence is that the victim doesn't want their children to face the abuse, so they stay in this relationship as the scapegoat for the abuse. Final reason is lack of knowledge. Lots of the time, victims don't realize the extent of the abuse because they have become accustomed to it. Oftentimes, you will find that a victim of domestic violence in an intimate relationship also experienced violence as a child with their parents. Finally, I want to draw your attention to the cycle of abuse. Looking at stages 3 and 4, the abuser apologizes for all they've done and promises that it won't happen again. Because the victim wants the old version of the relationship to return, they believe them and stay. Like I said earlier, lots of people in abusive relationships stay because they don't know the extent of the violence they face. This may be because after living in it for so long, they've become accustomed to it, but that's not the only potential reason they've grown numb to the abuse. It is common that victims of domestic abuse also experience a type of child abuse or neglect. When someone grows up surrounded by unhealthy relationships, it can affect how they define love and normal behavior. Without proper support or education, the cycle often continues into adulthood, where they find themselves in another abusive relationship similar to that of their childhood. Domestic violence is a major issue around us today. That's why we believe the solutions we've come up with can be effective ways to decrease domestic violence rates.
Our 2 solutions that we've come up with include supporting at-risk youth and supporting social services programs.
Our first solution is to introduce more supports for at-risk youth. To start, let's understand what we mean by at-risk youth. These are kids that exhibit certain behaviors like violent tendencies and substance abuse, or kids that grew up in an abusive household. Kids meet this criteria are statistically more likely to become abusive and become domestic violence offenders. We were grateful enough to discuss the solution with Child Protection Supervisor Nicole Ansel. She told us that it is often these kids are likely to offend because of the harsh realities of the system and their lack of healthy coping strategies. We propose the idea of having programs that teach these kids healthy coping mechanisms right from a young age. They could be located right in schools or daycares. Once social services becomes known of a family situation, kids can be worked with more diligently in hopes to prevent any unhealthy behaviors from progressing.
Our next solution almost goes hand in hand with our first, and it is to give more support to the current social service programs. Examples of these are transition houses, crisis hotlines, counseling, and therapy. These are all programs that exist but lack many resources like money and workers. We suggest allocating more resources to the Department of Social Services to allow the gaps in these programs to be filled.
Based on the 2 solutions we provided, we believe that supporting at-risk youth is the best solution because it is a way to end the cycle and stop someone from offending before they have the opportunity to do so. Essentially, hurt people end up hurting people, so by helping those that are hurt, rather than allowing them to fall victims of a broken system, we can decrease domestic violence rates in the future. Early intervention through education, mentorship, and mental health support can give young people the tools they need to build healthy relationships. By investing in youth today, we are creating a safer community for tomorrow.
Thank you for watching Pep Talks. If you or anyone you know is trapped in an abusive relationship, contact your local police department or social services.
Or call the SASC hotline for abuse, and remember, you're not alone.